Ladies and gentlemen, this is the program on constitutional government, and our speaker today is Amy Wax, Professor Amy Wax. Professor Amy Wax is an accomplished troublemaker. She doesn't look very frightening, but somehow she's caused fright in many people, and I hope I'm not accomplishing trouble for you in calling you that. She's a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She's published widely in law journals addressing liberal theory, welfare work requirements, the economics of federal disability laws, and she's working now on same-sex marriage, disparate impact theory, and group demographics, rational choice and family structure, the law, the neuroscience of deprivation. And her most recent book is Race, Wrongs, and Remedies, Group Justice in the 21st Century. She was an assistant to the Solicitor General in the Office of the Solicitor General of the U.S. Department of Justice in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and argued 15 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. She's a graduate of Yale, and then she's got a medical degree, an MD from the Harvard Medical School, and after that, she went to Columbia Law School. So Amy Wax, and she's going to talk on the perils of the quest for equal results in academia.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here back in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I spent a number of years in my long and fractious academic career. Here's how I'm going to go in this talk. I'm going to begin with a brief account of some recent experiences I had at my home institution, Penn Law School, and then try to draw some broader lessons from that experience for the future of the academy and society as a whole, and in particular for the future of free expression. And I will try to be brief because I know that Q&A is the best part of any presentation, although I also know that it's hard for law professors to be brief. And my strange saga began on August 9th of 2018 when I published an op-ed with San Diego law professor Larry Alexander in my local newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, entitled "Paying the Price for the Breakdown of the Country's Bourgeois Culture." The piece listed some ills currently afflicting American society and suggested that a renewed embrace of so-called bourgeois values, that is, the well-worn cultural script for mature adulthood that prevailed before the 1960s, might help relieve some of those problems. In what became perhaps the most controversial passage, we pointed out that all cultures are not equal. Some are more successful in preparing people to be productive in technological societies than others. In an interview the next day about the op-ed in our school newspaper, the Daily Pennsylvanian, I defended the assertion that some cultures are better than others. Functionally superior was the term I used, by pointing out how people vote with their feet. Global migrants flock to white European countries and don't risk their lives in rickety boats to go to Venezuela or Zimbabwe. However, I was told that at least one of those places is landlocked. Our piece and the selective statements quoted in the paper evoked a firestorm from the media and in academia. Groups at Penn and elsewhere labeled me a racist, bigot, white supremacist, xenophobe, hater, that familiar litany of accusatory terms, and we know them all. Some colleagues published a piece criticizing our praise of the 1950s on the grounds that the shortcomings of that era, which we acknowledged in the op-ed, rendered the whole period irredeemably evil. A flimsy argument, but at least an argument. But not long afterwards, 33 of my colleagues, law professors, half of our faculty, signed a so-called open letter in our school newspaper that, quote, condemned and categorically rejected, unquote, all my views. That letter contained no justification, explanation, or reasons. It was devoid of any argument. It didn't even specify the views it was condemning. After a storm of online criticism of the letter, 1 month later, the main instigator, our own little Torquemada, posted a rambling 15,000-word refutation of our tiny 800-word op-ed on the website Heterodox Academy. He argued, in effect, to the extent that I can figure out what he was saying, that bourgeois values are worthless and make no difference. Once again, an argument. In response, however, I asked him personally whether he would rather live in a neighborhood where 85% of the people abide by bourgeois values or one where 85% flout those values. He categorically refused to answer me. I don't do hypotheticals, he said. Having argued before the United States Supreme Court, I can assure you that the Chief Justice would not be amused. And despite his argument and his evasion, he never explained to me, and no one ever did, why it was necessary to gang up and publicly condemn me first. That summer, one colleague told me angrily that the hurt and damage I inflicted on Penn Law through the op-ed ruined his summer. That's a quote. Another said the open letter was necessary to, quote, get my attention, so I would, quote, never write anything like that again. In other words, please shut up. These were not responses friendly to dissenting views, to say the least. My colleagues repeatedly used language that one would use against an enemy, not a colleague. And last December, my own dean asked me to take a leave in the coming year to stop teaching a mandatory first-year course. Why? Because he was under pressure to banish me, and he hoped that my going away would cause people to forget my infractions. Of course, I refused. When I reported our conversation in a Wall Street Journal piece last February, he publicly denied that he had ever asked me to leave for the reasons stated. Dear listener, I assure you he had. And then he sent me an irate email from his iPhone stating, "You're a liar, Amy." Now, these events show how key rules of the road for academic discourse, rules like engaging in civil debate, giving reasoned justifications for positions, not calling names, not using slurs, being honest and forthright, were routinely violated by my institution. And I don't need to tell you, they are repeatedly violated at others. We could be here all day telling anecdotes about what is going on in academia. Now, this is all in a good cause, of course, advancing the progressive agenda, advancing it by any means necessary. And notice here I am talking about academic discourse and not the First Amendment. That's an important point. The First Amendment limits public but not private institutions. The public-private distinction is an important one for our system because it helps reduce the government's power to control our lives, at least it's supposed to. And I'm happy to talk about this more. That means that private institutions like Penn and Harvard technically can censor all they want. So this is not about legal rights. Rather, I want to make a normative point. They should not. They should give the widest possible ambit to dissent because I submit that is essential to their educational mission and indeed to the integrity of our democracy as a whole. Now, who is responsible for these developments, for this hostility to genuine dissenting views? With few exceptions today, as we probably know, it is the progressive left because the progressive left dominates academia. And what that means is that increasingly power and politics determine who gets to speak and what they get to say. I submit that our universities and our elite universities, especially, are no longer sites of free and fearless inquiry. They have become sites of orthodoxy, mercilessly enforced. As Jonathan Haidt and Heterodox Academy stated in response to my colleague's open letter condemning me, every open letter you sign to condemn a colleague for his or her words brings us closer to a world in which academic disagreements are resolved by force and political power not by argumentation and persuasion. And that is the world that we occupy today. Now, this brings me to the denouement of my story and some lessons I want to draw from that, and I will get to the topic of the quest for equal results. Sometime after my op-ed appeared, student activists at the Black Law Students Association at Penn, who were continually looking for dirt on me, unearthed and then complained about a podcast I did with Glenn Lowry, who is an economics professor at Brown, on a site called Blogging Heads. I made the point in that Blogging Heads, as part of a broader discussion, that racism was an implausible explanation for many of the disparities observed between minorities and other law students, both in school and beyond school, for example, in obtaining prestigious judicial clerkships or partnerships in elite law firms. There had recently appeared an article in the New York Times about partnerships in elite New York law firms and the paucity of minorities there. Rather, I said student performance, student grades, so-called supply-side factors, to use the economist's parlance, are a better explanation. Then Glenn Lowry turned to affirmative action, which is a special interest of his. In response to his queries, I said, and these were the words objected to, that I could not recall any Black students at Penn Law graduating at the top of the class, and that in my own first-year civil procedure class, which I teach every year, where I have about 100 students, I rarely remembered any scoring in the top half, perhaps a handful in 25 years. I, of course, was drawing on my own experience in making this assertion, but also my experience on the clerkship committee, where I see student rank. I went on to speculate that affirmative action sometimes places minority students in settings where they are academically overmatched, hardly an original observation, and that this might pose an uphill battle for them. Once unearthed, my observations, my few sentences about student performance went viral, resulting in a social media blitz and renewed demands that I be fired or at least removed from my mandatory class. This time, the dean caved. He acquiesced in short order, and he announced the decision with no notice to me in an email sent to the entire Penn community. I want to pause for a minute to contemplate what that message said and what it did not say, because I think that message is emblematic of the way things are discussed in academia today. The dean claimed that my assertions, which he said were false, inaccurate, but in a typical catch-22 fashion, offered no data to back up the claim, and indeed stated that the school did not collect information by race. He said that through those statements, I had violated confidentiality rules, no authority for that, but above all, that I had spooked my students. That Black students assigned to my class, quote, may reasonably wonder whether their professor has come to conclusions about their presence, their performance, and potential for success, and quote, that they may legitimately question whether her belittling statements will adversely affect their learning environment. Now think about that. The statements I made, which the dean insisted were inaccurate, with no factual backup, will, quote, adversely affect their learning environment. It is worth asking, what does this mean and how do we gauge those effects? Can we examine these statements objectively? Do minority students in my class earn lower grades than in other first-year classes? Of course, the claim that I actively penalize them is a non-starter because we have blind grading at Penn Law in the first year, a fact that the dean omitted to notice. Maybe it means my presence in the classroom impedes their learning, but then minority students should have measurably worse grades in my procedure class than in others. And all of this can be established by looking at the numbers. But so far, no effort whatsoever has been made to examine the facts, and I predict that no effort will be because facts are beside the point. The beauty of the dean's allegations is that they don't matter. His email is a fact-free zone. What matters is perceptions and feelings. Professors who hold unpopular positions or state inconvenient facts are psychologically toxic, and that's all that counts. If their presence causes offense or distress, fear of ill treatment or discrimination, or to use the latest buzzword, dehumanization, whatever that means, that is enough to eject them from the classroom. And of course, these perceptions, these feelings, they are subjective. They are self-confirming. They are immune from challenge. It's all in the mind of the beholder, and the beholder's mind reigns supreme. As Glenn Lowry eloquently pointed out in criticizing my dean's actions, allowing subjective student discomfort, mere assertions of discomfort, to determine whether a teacher gets to teach amounts to a weapon of mass destruction. It is an all-purpose device for penalizing professors who hold unorthodox views or discuss distressing realities. And the possible scenarios are endless. Objections based on discomfort can be concocted out of a host of observations or positions. The list goes on and on. A professor supports Trump or believes that colonialism was sometimes a positive good, or that women are less interested in science on average than men, or illegals should be deported. I need to give you any more examples. The decision to indulge these sorts of reactions knows no limits. And it is especially pernicious in assuming away professionalism. It assumes that professors cannot separate their political or scholarly positions from their classroom conduct and relationships. This brings me to the topic of the quest for equality of results, which I believe is grievously eroding academic values today. I submit that the aggressive, dogmatic pursuit of equality, defined as equality of outcomes, and especially group outcomes, has become an unquestionable item of faith in the academy today. And I suggest that that pursuit, which is bound up with the obsession with identity, diversity, and inclusion that is now pervasive in the academy and of course has seeped out into society as a whole, right, threatens the core of the academic enterprise. It casts a pall of orthodoxy on thought and speech in many areas culturally dominated by elites which received their training in these very universities. And that quest results in the twisting, hiding, distortion, and punishment of reality and the penalization of those who point to and discuss inconvenient facts and dissident ideas. As David Azarad of the Heritage Society has observed, in the quest of equal results, or at least the assumption of equal results, all good people are constrained to denounce the mistreatment of designated groups at the hands of an unjust society and to praise their accomplishments, whether real or fake, genuine or fabricated. Those who venture beyond this safe space do so at their peril. And of course, the accuracy of his words is reflected in the reaction to our statements and observations about bourgeois values, cultural differences, Black student performance, the downsides of affirmative action. Indeed, in the university today, ideas about group differences and observations about possible sources of those differences must be suppressed and denied unless they are made to fit the dominant narrative. And what is that narrative? Ours is an irredeemably racist, sexist, bigoted society, and all group disparities flow from discrimination. Correct thinking on racial preferences is even more baroque, convoluted, and self-contradictory. All virtuous people accept that affirmative action is good and necessary. But the academic disparities that make it necessary, although sometimes glaringly obvious, may not be mentioned in polite company, or if mentioned, they are illusory or insignificant or the product of racism or amenable to instant correction through the offices of racial preferences or government services, programs, and initiatives without end. Indeed, central to affirmative action as practiced today, I submit, is a tenacious myth, which I have elsewhere dubbed the central myth of affirmative action. Once beneficiaries arrive at their institution of higher learning, they instantly catch up. Group differences disappear. And any suggestion that the myth is just that is reconfigured as an attack on minority students themselves, as some kind of trauma or badge of inferiority. In the climate that prevails at the university, as well as many workplaces, this set of rhetorical moves amounts to the position that affirmative action can never be assessed or questioned. It's untouchable. And the evasions that surround affirmative action, really, this is just one topic in which those moves are made. We have moved to a higher plane, out of politics. We've discovered the truth, and Professor Mansfield, of course, has said as much. Unequal outcomes must be ignored, denied, or eliminated, or if noticed, ascribed to racism. We're talking here about not just academic performance, workplace success, rates of school discipline, wealth, home ownership, credit, and lending. The list goes on. These can never be attributed to anything that victims choose to do, certainly not anything that individuals can control, never to behavior, to choice, to performance. Examples are everywhere. And I can give you examples from home lending, from school discipline. There's just an endless repository of examples that we can give. Now, this brings me back to affirmative action and how we're allowed to talk about it. The irony here is that, like a good conservative, I think that private institutions should be able to adopt any admission policy they want and let the chips fall where they may. But the problem is the chips are not allowed to fall where they may. They feed into elaborate taboos, charades, and untruths that pervade society. When the promised equal outcomes don't occur, and where the meritocracy still holds sway for everyone's benefit, we have resentment, disappointment, recrimination, accusations. Someone must be blamed, and that someone is us. And of course, we cannot defend ourselves by pointing to other choices and other causes for disparities. By requiring us to tell untruths on pain of social death, this regime is humiliating and unfair. It generates its own resentment and mistrust. And the distortion of the truth, I submit to you, is an important source of our current political divide and the so-called resentments that feed that political divide. Now, what are the implications of what I've said for education and academic institutions? As I've noted, I believe we are now dwelling in a climate of orthodoxy, fear, and intimidation. Students, faculty, alumni, and donors do not feel free to dissent from approved opinions, and that's, of course, exactly as progressives want it. They've got us where they want us, and they're very clever about it. Orthodoxy is especially potent among students, and I can attest to that through my own experience. They are in constant fear of being called out for sexism, racism, and the rest. They are under tremendous pressure not to utter wrong opinions in the classroom and elsewhere. They are afraid of their peers. And they are under pressure not to associate with dissenters like me. I have become toxic. I have been disinvited. I have been deplatformed. I can give you plenty of examples. The two most recent deplatformings were by student associations that, quote, are devoted to nonpartisan and balanced dialogue and free and open debate. Now, we all know how the discourse is controlled. Students and faculty have learned to traffic in the parlance of the grievance culture, that heckler's veto, the rhetoric of feelings of disrespect, hurt, insult, dehumanization. All of those terms are piled on. They are used to silence unpopular views and advance the cause of egalitarian identity politics. And the key is they're irrefutable, they're unanswerable. Now, the worst thing, and this is really important, is that no one in academia pushes back. Indeed, I am regularly struck by the refusal of those in authority at universities to rebuke or even remonstrate with students who interfere with speakers, or disinvite, or deplatform, or demand that individuals be banished, or whatever it is they're doing. We have growing armies of diversity bureaucrats who stand ready to monitor attitudes, receive complaints, and guard sensitivities. And in their quest to protect victims, they call out the dissenters and they back up the call out culture. They tell us which terms are forbidden crime thing. They issue rules. Nostalgia for the 50s is hate speech. Praising Western Civ is white supremacy. And finally, and most importantly, victim groups, historic and self-defining and growing in number, have been given virtually absolute veto power over what can be said in our universities and even who will be allowed to teach. And university administrators and brass, the higher ups, the people who are supposed to be in authority, they seem genuinely afraid of them. Now, this is a topic that I would like to discuss. I won't waste much more time on it. But Jonathan Haidt, the author of The Coddling of the American Mind, which some of you may know, recently told me in a discussion group that administrators can't push back. They can't remonstrate. They can't exert their authority. And I said to him, Jonathan, is that a normative statement or a positive statement? I never actually got a good answer. Now, the sad thing is that in bringing forward this parlance of the grievance culture, this rhetoric about hurt and trauma and dehumanization, students who complain about being offended promote and advertise their own psychological weakness. And here I reminisce about the story centered here at Harvard of Larry Summers giving a talk suggesting that men's and women's abilities pertinent to STEM accomplishment might differ, with the MIT scientist Nancy Hopkins confessing that she almost fainted and lost lunch. As a woman, I cringe not at Summers' suggestion, but at that story, which feeds into every cliche about women's mental weakness, their emotionality, their inability to deal calmly and objectively with challenging ideas. And of course, we have the same problem with minority students professing fragility, weakness, emotional trauma at adverse concepts, thoughts, and facts. And I come back to my law students, members of victim groups who say they need protection. I submit to you their victory is a Pyrrhic one. I find myself asking, are such people fit to lead, exercise power, and take responsibility? And I have to conclude that they are not. Yet we continue to infantilize our students by giving in to their untutored demands. Now, what is to be done about this politicization? Well, I'm going to make two brief suggestions. They are not by any means solutions of the definitive kind. I just throw them out here. First, on the local level, this sounds obvious, but I think we ought to continually be reminding students of the central mission of the university, which is to transmit traditions, but also to get at the truth. And that requires honest debate, which is intellectual hard work. It's bruising, it's difficult, it's not for the faint of heart. Unpleasant facts, disagreeable thoughts just go with the territory. They are intrinsic features of an open society. They cannot be avoided. I can tell you, students are not taught those lessons today, which I continually find quite shocking. In my own classroom, I impose 3 rules. First, no one can be heard to say, "I'm offended." Everyone has permission to be offended. They just can't express it. Second, no one is allowed to accuse anyone, inside or out, dead or alive, of being a racist, sexist, xenophobe, white supremacist, or to use any other derisive identity-based label. No slurs, no name calling. They don't enlighten or edify and add nothing of value. Third, no one can complain to administrators, those officious thought police, which burgeon by the minute, about anything said in our class. What is said in our class stays in our class. And if the students don't agree to those rules, I ask them not to take the course. The question is whether there is any hope of such protocols being implemented on a wide scale. And notice that these rules are not free speech rules. They actually ask students to inhibit some of their speech in the name of academic inquiry. Finally, I think that both the government and private donors need to rethink their lavish financial support for higher education. Why? When you look at the statistics, they're sobering. Elite higher education, selective institutions serve a teeny tiny percentage of the American population. It's really quite shocking. The top 30 to 40 schools serve only a few tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 undergraduates out of a country of 340 million. Secondly, and unfortunately, these institutions have become bastions of destructive thinking and anti-Western propaganda. I call this project Defund the Ivies. There's a lot to talk about here, a lot of detail to fill in, but I submit that private donors should stop giving to the Ivies and similar institutions. There are better ways to improve people's lives, and most importantly, to help the ordinary, average, unspecial people who have been unduly neglected by our elites and are increasingly walled off from them. And along this line, I urge you all to read Charles Murray's Coming Apart, which truly is a brilliant and prescient book. So where should the money go? There's lots of possibilities. It's not easy because a lot of what ails the middle of America is spiritual, it's intangible, it isn't really amenable to social programming and government programs. But we could start by supporting vocational education, and I visited a number of wonderful institutions along those lines, funding infrastructure improvement, beautifying public spaces, reforming K through 12 programs, which are a mess, promoting art, music, and enrichment, paying relocation costs of average workers. There are lots of other potential ideas, but don't give more money to Harvard. Princeton doesn't need your tens of millions. You may think that university science and medicine are immune. So I will close by telling you that they are not. I have close friends and family members in academic medicine. The obsession with diversity and inclusion is growing by the minute, right? That diversity preoccupation has moved into science and into medicine. The programs, the training, the mandatory courses on unconscious bias and the racism baked into our society are proliferating as we speak. Finally, I would plead for returning to an older conception of equality, one that enshrines opportunity, personal responsibility, and political and legal equality. I recently read a very wise piece in a British magazine called Standpoint. It was by a journalist called Toby Young. And he said, somehow a bunch of very naive people got it into their brain that all men are created equal is a hypothesis about how people are a blank slate. But it is nothing of the sort. The founders understood that all men are, in many important respects, unequal, and that our society has to deal with that fact. It does no one any good to enshrine a utopian egalitarian fantasy that depends on denial and the banishment of those who dare to notice reality. As my favorite undergraduate, Coleman Hughes at Columbia, said, being on the right side of history does not justify being on the wrong side of reality. Such a fantasy has to rest on force, not reason. It is antithetical to our way of life and should be resisted by all people of goodwill. So I invite you to join the resistance. Thank you.
There might be a question. Yes.
All right, thank you so much for being here. I agree with 99% of what you said, but one thing.
What's the 1%?
Well, you talked about this, the victim, these victim groups, and I would say that as an Asian American male conservative scientist, I'm the intersectional catastrophe. Because if there's any group that has been actually systematically discriminated against in America, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was the only legal race-based discrimination, policy. So I think that in the future, if you talk about the students, I would prefer language selected victim groups, because some of us lose on both ends, right? We were officially discriminated against by the U.S. government, and now we're supposed to make our way for reparations toward other more victimized groups, aka typical voter groups for the Democratic Party. I would say, but to further your point on the science, to me this looks like, and the language of the Cultural Revolution plus communism in terms of the thought police of the progressive left, and the sort of crazy reaction, in my opinion, is a symbol of impending collapse. And I think you can see this in the sciences in that if you're not there, you may sort of elevate this idea that, great research is being done in university. If you actually look what's going on, I would argue that all the leading future science and engineering efforts have actually left the academy because of these problems with, we can't hire the people that we want to hire, not just because of the identity politics, but also the bureaucratization. And if you think about what are the biggest areas, artificial intelligence, right? Which is the basis of, say, self-driving car, which will probably have a bigger impact than most of the technologies we see in the next few decades. Almost none of it was done in the academy, right? And they are now deployed, they are testing. Nobody gets PhDs in computer science anymore. They take a 1-year master's and then goes to a company. So because of all these additional restrictions, I would argue that we basically have run out of other people's money to spend at the places at which it would have the most impact. And so in fact, all of this is the left is driving academia off the cliff into irrelevance. And I appreciate the willingness to fight for it, but to me, you could argue that it's already gone.
Well, I don't know as much about the sector as you do. Once again, I know a lot about the biomedical sector just because of the people I know there, and it amazes me the speed and the rapidity with which the bureaucratization, the inversion of priorities, the centrality of all of these social imperatives, right, to achieve parity has become the top priority. So when there are meetings about hiring, when there are meetings about grantsmanship, oversight committees of, Penn Med, and I have moles in Penn Med, They say 80% of the talk is about why don't you have a black,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, radiologist heading this department, which is really about a unicorn. You know, I mean, it's a fantasy world.
And my point is that the innovation now is not therefore being
Well, but I'm
capable of
saying
being
that's the
done.
secondary effect.
Yeah.
But what interests me, and I'll just say one thing, is that how much this thinking has infected the business community and even Silicon Valley. So, you know, you go to Google or Amazon, or I don't know what the big firms are, you know, even the high tech firms like Palantir, and they are also in the grip of this. I mean, the James Damore debacle, which I didn't talk about, you know, is emblematic. I mean, this poor guy got totally blindsided. And what do we have? We have the women at Google going to their bosses saying, if James Damore is occupying an office down the hall, I can't think and I can't work. I mean, it's that kind of rhetoric that
and my point
is
is the
controlling.
capital markets will extinguish this because they will out-innovate the existing institutions which are not nimble enough. So
Yeah, but
just
my
like-
question
yeah.
is, why do the bosses respond? You see, so I'm going back to Jonathan Haidt's question. You know, I said to Jonathan Haidt, why didn't the dean of Yale call that woman in who screamed at the Christakises on, you know, on tape and say, you behaved inappropriately? You don't even have to expel her. Just say, no, we don't, not here, not now, we don't do this, as the president of the University of the Arts said about efforts to banish Camille Paglia. Why don't people push back? Why don't the brass at Google push back and say, no, we invited James Damore to express his opinion. It's his opinion. Read it, don't agree with it, get back to work. That's my question. Why the spinelessness? What are they afraid of? Everybody
yes.
has an opinion about that.
I'll try to take you up on that. That's exactly what they're afraid of, but you said join the counter-revolution, but is what you're fighting, what we're fighting, simply a revolution, or is it a religion? I jotted down some of the terms you used in your talk. Obviously, you're playing with the thought that it's a religion. You used myth, untouchable, taboos, orthodoxy, dissenters, toxic, utopian, egalitarian fantasy. So, the folks who are afraid to fight this, who obviously are half believers or 2/3 believers themselves, you know, can one fight a religion, religious fanaticism, with facts, with common sense, with bourgeois values, with return to the 50s, or would there be a need for a new religion? I don't know.
Well, if you look back to, you know, the history of Western Civ, there's something called the Enlightenment, which didn't abandon religion entirely, but kept it within bounds. Right? So, you know, the proper place of it, the proper bounds of it, that's really what's key. And one of my favorite quotes is Lord Patrick Devlin, who was a 19th century, 20th century jurist. I guess he lived into the 20th century, and he was part of the debate on whether homosexuality should be removed from, you know, punishment or illegality. And here's one of the things he said. He said, fornication, a term my students don't know, will never be stamped out. It's a little bit like incontinence, you know, like that has to do with urine, right? It will never be stamped out, he said. The key is to keep it within bounds. And there is so much profundity in that statement, right? We will never stamp out these religious impulses. We will never stamp out deviance. We will never stamp out bohemianism. We will never stamp out, you know, disorder, but we can structure things to keep it within bounds. And I think what we learned in the West for some time was to keep religion within bounds. That's the separation of church and state, the creation of a secular state, the enshrinement of reason in its proper sphere. I think we need to go back to some of that stuff. How to do it is hard.
But maybe keeping in bounds was possible only as long as religion was out there and had some strength in people's lives, and once it's gone, they've got to find some crazy new religion.
I don't know, you know, what kind of, I'm not sure that that's a law of nature. I think we can fight the metastasis would be the word of these irrational impulses with the usual tools, which is facts and reason. I mean, I think, you know, David Reich is here, and he dared to say that genomics is going to confront us with some very unpleasant realities about human nature, about groups, and it's going to get harder and harder to deny those facts. I am very interested, and maybe I won't live long enough to see how that's suppressed, how those facts are going to be, those realities are going to be dealt with. I don't envy people in biological anthropology or in genomics. It's going to be interesting. That's just one set of realities. I mean, there's so much obsession with group disparities and group differences and equality that's got to be a really important area of tension. I think sex differences are also an important area of tension, because it strikes me, and I'll shut up in a second, that the more the role of women changes, the more it remains the same. I do a lot of reading on the right of, ideas, publications. I get a lot of publications from think tanks. I'm part of that conversation. And it amazes me, it is 90% male. The people who are out there thinking, writing, exchanging ideas, part of the mix, in the swim, they're overwhelmingly male. It confirms every cliche about the differences between men and women. So these differences are not going away.
Jim.
I have doubts about your proposal to defund the Ivies, and the reason is not just that I happen to be an Ivy League professor, but
Self-interest is
actually, we had recently had this experience, you undoubtedly heard about it here at Harvard, with the administration deciding to stigmatize final clubs, single-sex final clubs, including female final clubs. They were blatantly informed about the existence of female final clubs, but nevertheless, and the reason they could do that, as we discovered, was that they the final clubs have been the enemy of the administration for as long as I've been at Harvard, which is 34 years. They've always hated them, but their hand has been restrained up till now because the final clubs are a major source of income, or they network with Wall Street. The final club people tend to end up in Wall Street and finance one kind or another, and that's a huge source of income for Harvard, or was. And they did studies, which are still secret apparently, that the Harvard fundraising in the future is going to come from India and from China. So they can do away with, they don't need the Wall Street anymore. Or it's going to come from tech, which is overwhelmingly on the left. So they don't need Wall Street anymore, they don't want the money anymore, so they can get rid of the final club. So my point is that if, as they say in Washington, you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And if there are no people restraining Harvard by giving money to Harvard, then it'll just become more and more left. And as we know, despite all the talk about ideals and making the world a better place, one thing Harvard administrators really like is money.
Money is driving it.
Yeah, if you have conservative donors who are giving money, for example, to found chairs in Western civilization, or they won't be able to do that. I think now that's impossible, but they could found chairs in European history, for example, which are very rare. That would be a useful thing.
Well, I can honestly say I'm not clear on how China and India are going to be funding Harvard University, but I will say this.
They're doing it now.
I have a fantasy that I would wake up tomorrow and no one would give another penny to, the top 40 private institutions, and that would get their attention. But there are many very formidable obstacles to that, and perhaps the most formidable, going around the country and talking to people about it, is what I call the little Caitlin problem. So Brian Kaplan wrote a very good book called The Case Against Education, and the essence of the book is the signaling hypothesis, which is not really original to him, which is that what the Ivies and the selective universities are they are just a massive, extravagant, efficient HR department for elite jobs. And they sort and select. And then it's not just the people who get in. He says there is a function served by going through those 4 years because you're selecting for smarts and also for what he calls conformity. I call it conscientiousness, which is jumping through that hoop and graduating. But what does that mean? It means that what people actually learn at Harvard, nobody really cares. I can tell you the parents do not care, okay? They just want little Caitlin in. They want her out. They want her getting into med school or getting that job at Goldman Sachs. So how do you get them to focus on what's actually happening at Harvard? It's really difficult. It's really hard to do because honestly, on some level, they don't care. Now, I have had parents say to me, I spent $300,000 to send my daughter to Stanford, and she came back and told me that I was a toxic, pernicious, bigoted, racist, paternalistic white male. Please, Dad, don't forget to sign the next check. But that doesn't seem to make any difference to them. They are still, so I don't know how to solve the little Caitlin problem, really. And that to me is like the main obstacle to stop. But I think that if we don't stop and we don't start paying attention to the deplorables in the middle who really hate the Ivies. I've gone around the country and spoken to a lot of different interesting citizens groups because of, my Wall Street Journal article, which got like deluged. I got thousands and thousands and thousands of messages as a result of that, which surprised me. They are very angry. They really feel like the Ivies live in a bubble and they exist to serve themselves, all papered over by a lot of highfalutin rhetoric, right? This does have implications for politics. Absolutely does. A lot of people, I won't use the T word, well, I will, vote for Trump because they're terrified of the Democrats. They're terrified of them. And all of the sort of progressive types who have captured them. I don't have an easy solution to this.
Jacob.
So I appreciate your idea for your class and requiring students, that kind of this confidentiality type of thing. And as a conservative at Harvard, I've actually noticed that, especially on the class level and the academic level, I'm a history concentrator in Gov Secondary, so I haven't taken any classes in women's and gender studies or sociology, so I can't say this for sure. But typically it seems as if many of the professors are actually more open to conservative ideas. I've also been fortunate to take classes with Professor Mansfield and Professor Hankins. And even the ones who aren't conservative typically are intelligent enough to recognize the importance of having a discourse in the class. But the real issue, at least that I find, is more of the administration. Because I think it's actually better if you're not intelligent to be in the administration and to be running the university. And besides donations, one of the things that the administration obviously takes into account are admission statistics. And every year, obviously, the acceptance rate of Harvard keeps on going down. So the admissions committee, that basically tells them that people still want to come here. And conservative students aren't going to shoot themselves in the foot and say, I'm not going to go to Harvard and just, I'll go to, Hillsdale is a great school, but, you don't have many conservative students who would take Hillsdale over Harvard. So how do you, without conservatives hurting themselves, how do you kind of change the administration's from externally, besides the donations, withdrawing donations and promoting free speech and discourse without hurting conservatives?
Well, first of all, the fact that the admissions rate keeps going down, and we had this issue at Penn, it to me means that, it does not matter what you do. It does not matter what rules you impose. People are, when they get into Harvard, they're going to come to Harvard because it's this HR department, because that's the entree to being part of upper middle class America. And, our dean says, well, I have to, he doesn't say it in so many words, but I have to kowtow to the black students. I have to placate the black students, because if I don't, people won't come to Penn Law. My view is they look at the rankings and they go to the best place they get into. So that's liberating. That should be liberating, right? But we're not liberated. And the reason we're not liberated is we've hired just this plethora, it's endless, of diversity and inclusion people, and they have to have something to do. I mean, Heather McDonald in the Wall Street Journal just this week listed all the diversity and inclusion apparatus at Yale, and yet they're going to keep adding to it. So my other fantasy is we wake up tomorrow when every single one of these people is fired. Every single one, okay? When I went to Yale in the early 70s, I tell my students, we had none of this stuff, none of this stuff. I mean, there was a registrar and maybe one secretary to help her, okay? And you know what? And students hate to hear this because they think things are getting better and better. Said it was better. Yale in the 1970s was better by a mile, by 100 miles than it is now. Even for a woman like me in one of the first classes at Yale, they can't. Now how do you get from here to there? How do we get to more and more meddlesome administrator guardians of student sensibility to zero administrator guardians of student sensibility? I don't know. I agree with you that the professors are a mixed bag. The other problem is the peers. I think students, from what I gather, are much more afraid of fellow students than they are of anybody else. And I'll add a little gender twist, right? There's something I call the new Lysistrata. Women on average tend to be more left than men. The real conservatives, I have found, are men. And, the women won't have anything to do with them. They won't date them. They won't have sex with them. And when they find out that they worked on, the Kavanaugh hearings, I've had students tell me they'll get up and they'll walk out of the bar. Now, I think these women are crazy and, they'll all be cat ladies. It's going to be good for cats. But this is the future is going to be very good for cats.
Is that accurate, or would you agree with that denunciation of student peer pressure?
Oh, I think it's pretty horrible among the students. I mean, you have to.
It's a small vocal minority of social justice warriors, too, because most of them are normies. Most of the students are normies.
You have to be willing to be a contrarian, which, fortunately, I am more than happy to be a contrarian on campus. But yeah, it's definitely among the students. It's pretty brutal.
Harvey.
Well, I went to Yale in the early 60s, and you're right, it was much better then. Two things. One, you talked about why doesn't the administration push back? And I read the Heather McDonald article as well. My sense is that the administration is ideologically simpatico with her. They don't push back, not because they're afraid to or they're limited, but because they like the ideas that are being promulgated by the left.
They're true believers. They are.
So they're not going to push back. You're not going to get the resistance there. But I was curious, it was a passing reference about colleagues that are intimidated from speaking out, implying that there are other members of the faculty that you must come across every once in a while that have an antipathy to the leftward bias of the university. You can't be the only one at Penn or at the Ivy League schools. And the question is, where are they, and is there any way of somehow galvanizing them into some kind of coordinated effort? I know that, just from what you went through, that it's very dangerous for somebody to do that. But there can also be strength in numbers. I mean, if there is an aggregation of people from a number of high-level universities who get together and produce an open letter of their own, would that be the kind of thing that would signal that there are other points of view on the campus that are worthy of airing and worthy of attention?
Yeah, well, a couple of points. First of all, I think the administrators tend to come from a cadre of sort of middling types without a strong commitment to academic values. There are more faculty than there are administrators who get it, right? I mean, I've quoted this before, but A.E. Housman said the love of truth is the weakest of human passions, right? And it really is. Most people don't care much about the truth. They care about other things, religion, their job, being nice, right? So there's been a kind of feminization of the middle ranks. That's a problem. The second, so there is, I think, a big generational divide in academia. I do have some older colleagues, one of them is in the room, who very much are old school liberals, might even be willing to speak out, although those are precious few in number because they've got theirs. Here's the problem with the younger generation. They have been educated, they have been miseducated. They have never been exposed to conservative ideas. They've never read the Federalist Papers, they've never read Burke, they've never heard of Oakeshott, they've never heard of Richard Weaver, they've never heard of James Burnham, they've never heard of any of this stuff. You know, they've never even read Charles Murray. They condemn the bell curve, but they never actually opened the book. There is a massive, one-sided, unbalanced miseducation going on, and those people are all very smart, you know, because you go to school with them. But they come out thinking that they cannot mount a counter defense to the prevailing progressive notions because they don't have the vocabulary, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the background. It's hard work. Okay, I teach a course in conservative political and legal thought. It was hard work for me to get ready for that course, and I've been reading this stuff my whole life long. So I think that is a major gap in our education system, and it starts in K through 12. The biggest complaint I heard going around the country was K through 12 is totally corrupted. It has become a social justice warrior shop. All right, and where do we begin? You cannot mount a defense or a set of counter moves, especially since the progressives claim the moral high ground. We're good people, you're evil. Reductio ad Hitlerum, reductio ad Jim Crow, right? Nationalism will lead to World War III. I mean, how do you counter that? You have to know a lot in order to argue that. And there are pointy-headed conservative intellectuals out there, the Claremont Review, the Heritage Foundation, but they're not connecting with young people. And that's a problem.
David.
I agree with all the trends you've outlined, but I think about how the people in this room might try to fight a rearguard action against those forces. And the idea that occurs to me is an attempt to dramatically open up the space of discussion, at least at Harvard, especially to make students who are conservative feel less like they're on the far right and really give the full spectrum. Do you think it would be wise or suicide to invite a collection of speakers to Harvard, not you, but Steve Saylor and John Derbyshire and Jared Taylor,
right?
Would that be wise or suicide? To make Harvard go a little bit back in the direction that you would like it to go?
Well, I think it would be impossible. I mean, Jared Taylor, John Derbyshire, these are friends of mine. These are amazingly erudite, smart, intelligent people who, have a lot to say. Eric Kaufman, people like that. But
it's not impossible. It's not impossible in the sense that we can rent a room. There are faculty members here. We can invite someone.
I don't know what to say to that. I mean, my personal view is that students should routinely be exposed to those people.
And isn't it our responsibility to expose them?
It's interesting how students find those people, right? They find them through their friends or their dissatisfaction with, the current wisdom, received wisdom. I don't know what would happen if you invited these people to Harvard. You know, it's unpredictable.
Harvey's gonna have a busy fall. Sorry.
Question over here.
Hi. Just to quickly address the corporate, you were wondering why there isn't more pushback in.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
You were wondering why there wasn't more pushback in the corporate world,
Right.
The way there is in academia. I think that, it's the ability to hit corporations, in the wall through these organized campaigns, don't buy from so-and-so, they're bigoted, etc. So I think people like Google and other places are pretty terrified that they're going to get blacklisted and people like, coastal elites will simply avoid them, or their brand will be irreparably damaged.
Sure.
As far as like some optimism for the next 10 or 20 years, I'm wondering what you make of the possibility that Asian men, Indian, Chinese, and their affiliated ethnicities, I feel like we are the most obvious demographic bloc that can resist these trends in academia. And not only that, we're kicking ass. Like, we are rising through the ranks in academia, media, corporations, everything, STEM, you name it. Like there's some departments that are almost 50% Indian and Chinese American. So, I think we're keeping a low profile now, we're biding our time. But when we reach the critical mass, we are going to push back and we are going to be merciless. And we are not going to give a flying fuck about the grievances of the blacks, students, or anything else. And, I've reached this, state of awareness over the last 10 years over being very liberal. And I think that we, speaking for more than just myself, I find that, we are well positioned to debate the most unhinged white liberals because they cannot use white privilege to silence us. We have our brown privilege, going to be like, get the fuck out of here. I've been colonized. I know what it's like. You can use your own identity politics to hang yourself. Mm-hmm. We just have to keep at bay the women amongst our ranks.
Good luck with that.
And be unafraid, that they're not going to want to date us or they're going to think we're, barbarians. I play hardball from the first date. You know what I mean?
You might think about killing all cats. Can I just comment on this? Because this is a really interesting topic. And you're absolutely right that the thing about Asian men is that, people can't use the white privilege thing against them. So that's one instrument or one weapon that's been disarmed. Because I think white men also are really fed up, or some of them. But here's the problem, and Rehan Salam, who's now the new head of the Manhattan Institute, has written very, I think, shrewdly about this. He says, well, there's a puzzle. Why do Asians, Indians, Chinese, other Asian minorities vote so Democratic? Why don't they cross over into the conservative camp? This is sort of the same puzzle that I've been puzzling about my whole life about Jews, right? Because I'm Jewish. And he says, well, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, and he says it nicely, but he says there's a kind of element of conformity, don't rock the boat to their culture, that, there isn't the kind of Whiggish revulsion against concentrations of power, love of liberty, that heart doesn't beat in their breast in the same cultural way, maybe. And so there's don't make waves, don't make trouble idea. And especially since, Asian men really are, as you say, kicking ass, progressing. They're taking over academic medicine. So they're doing really well. So why would we rock the boat when things are going so well? And all of that kind of adds up to keep your head down. And there's a final thing, says Rehan Salam. I think I don't remember where this essay appeared, but it was quite shrewd. He says, Asians will look at who's in the elite and what their mores are, what their cultural practices are, you know, what their culture is, and say, well, we want to be like them. And of course, what is the elite like in our country? They're very progressive, they're very left, they profess all of these ideas. They're, you know, card-carrying members of the Democratic Party. They're We Love Bernie. And so we're just going to kind of be like them. So when you put all that together, it's a hard sell.
Right.
You probably know it better than I do, right?
Right. I read that essay by Rehan,
And then you've got the ladies.
yeah.
Right.
Well, I have no trouble with the ladies. I'm willing to say whatever reality leads me to say. So, you know, I think that right now there's a congealing awareness, and we're kind of on the cusp of it, because I know more and more people with my background, Indian American, raised in Saudi Arabia, like that are like, yeah, Trump may be pretty ridiculous, but in terms of the forces we're arrayed against, we have
Right.
to use our best weapon, you know? So many of the Harvard and Yale educated colleagues I have are like, Trump 2020, we gotta keep this going, just because it's getting
Yeah.
out of control, you know? Like, we're gonna have the demands for redistribution and
The alternative is too horrible to
reparations
contemplate.
are just,
Yeah.
they make no logical sense, they do not work. Like, for example, the $8 billion investment in low-performing schools. My girlfriend is actually a Chicago public school principal. So over the time that we've dated, like, she's had one painful realization after another.
She's getting woke, I hope.
Yeah, or unwoke, it depends how you define.
Right,
use the
I
word
define woke. The other side's taken over woke, so, exactly.
Catherine.
Thank you. I admire your courage, and I agree with what you say about the harm involved in is trying for equality of result. I just wonder whether you think, with your plea for a return to an older notion of equality, political and legal equality, whether you think that that's a fully adequate alternative, or whether you think that there are problems with that as well. I mean, it just strikes me as problematic to accept that there, you know, if we have political and legal equality, but de facto inequality of outcomes, not merely for individuals, but for groups, kind of permanently accepting that. And it does seem like a problem that these achievements, of course, we very much attach honor to them, and therefore implicitly, you know, human worth is basically attached to these unequal outcomes. It seems like that implies unequal human worth of different groups, if you simply accept that, and especially, obviously, in a country with a history of one group enslaving another big group. I mean, it's not that I have a better solution, but it strikes me that what you're making a plea for is now without its problems.
Well, of course it has problems. I mean, there are a couple of things. First of all, there is something called equality of opportunity, which will never be achieved, right? But there are lots of things we can do to try and, as they say, level the playing field to some extent. We never will entirely, because we've got the family and we have sort of private society, which makes the playing field unequal. But we've made great strides in achieving more equality of opportunity than we have. So I think legal and political equality and efforts to achieve equality of opportunity, as long as we keep it within bounds, right? But I think what's taken over this society and is very pernicious is the notion that here's the problem, that the measure of a decent society is the life it offers to the average person, not the tiny elite. And we have become so obsessed with the elite because that's where we live, right, that we have forgotten that. So I reviewed a book by Richard Reeves about upward mobility. I'm blanking on the name of it, but he's obsessed with fewer people are moving into the top 20% than they used to. And I started out the review by saying, let's get one thing straight. Only 20% of the people can be in the top 20%. Can we just agree on that as a kind of basic premise? Okay? What about the other 80%? Now, I would highly recommend, if you have not read it, to go back and read the final chapter of the bell curve, chapter 22, because it is brilliant. And here's what Murray and Herrnstein say. They say, do not make the mistake that cognitive ability and your success in the meritocracy is the same as moral worth, because that is a basic pernicious mistake. Okay? We need to figure out how in society we can offer a life of dignity and worth and satisfaction to people who don't rise to the top of the meritocracy. And I'll tell you one way we used to do it. We used to do it by having these common norms and understandings, these bourgeois standards, these notions of roles and how to fulfill those roles honorably, right? Marriage, husband, wife, good worker, decent person, honesty, probity, rectitude, thrift, responsibility, right? Independence to the extent you could achieve it. And we've just blasted all that to hell. Right? That used to bring the classes together. There was a convergence, actually, and a consensus about what a decent life was. And it's something that could be fulfilled by people from the top to the bottom of the SES scale. And now, because we've just dissolved a lot of that, the only people who can really make it are the people who are expert in self-direction. I can tell you that the average person is not very good at making it up as they go along. They need guideposts, they need guardrails, they need aspirations, they need prescriptions, they need norms. And I think what we did in the 60s is we hurt the least among us. We really did. And, the people at the top are just completely blind to that. They think that everybody wants what they want. Francis Fukuyama, I'll just end by saying he wrote a not very good book called Identity, which I just read. But he did say something very wise. He said, most people are not interested in sort of discovering the inner depths of the self and exploring the far reaches of expressive individualism and, making themselves up as they go along by creating their own creative career trajectory. Most people are not interested in that. They're not capable of that. What gives their life meaning is, a dignified place in society, through work, through supporting their family, through connection, through faith, through family, those sorts of aspirations. That is the problem. We're engaged in this fundamental confusion. You're saying, but if different groups differ in their position in society, as they inevitably will, and I think the position of men and women in society will inevitably differ unless you just put a gun to everybody's head, that means women are less worthwhile somehow.
Robert.
Thank you so much for the talk. You spoke at length about the more pernicious effects of affirmative action, and I think one of the main effects of affirmative action that has really inflicted us here at Harvard is the idea that because Harvard has been forced to take less qualified students through this program, it's had to lower its standards of excellence in the classroom, so as to not have these students failing out. And I think that this notion has also started to permeate into the corporate world as well. Some of the entry-level jobs at the large investment banks, in consulting firms which recruit at Harvard, they allow for people from diverse backgrounds to gain internships in their sophomore summers, where everyone else has to wait until their junior summers. And these jobs that people are getting at places like Bain or Morgan Stanley aren't necessarily technically demanding jobs. They're just sort of, you can be trained in a few weeks, certainly have to put in very long hours, but the work that you're doing doesn't really take a very deep technical background. So I fear that much like at Harvard, in these banks and these other firms, there really isn't a market force that will punish companies that take less qualified workers because the standards have been lowered so much. So do you think that this problem is only going to persist?
into the future, or do you think that a market force will arise to punish the firms that discriminate?
Wow, I mean, that's a really hard question. I think there has been a dumbing down in many sectors. I mean, ironically, Harvard is the place where there's the least of it because even the minority students here, have remarkably good scores. The problem is the discrepancy. When you're a 700 math SAT in a class where everybody has 800, you're behind the 8 ball, even though you have a great score, right? So the dumbing down of society, I personally think that there is going to be a lot of dysfunction, but dysfunction like justice has a long arc, I think academic medicine, they've got great people, obviously, but they're push to get underrepresented minorities. Absolutely, it's going to lower standards. There's just no question about it. Will that have real palpable consequences? I really can't say because I think 90% of the great discoveries are generated by 5% of the people anyway. You do need that sort of upper middle rank of very competent, capable people to keep a highly technological society like ours going. I think you absolutely do. And I worry that it isn't going to keep going. Interestingly, the Boeing Max debacle worries me a lot. I don't know if that has anything to do with affirmative action. I have no idea. But it's worrisome. It's very worrisome to me that they slopped through that thing. And where does that laxity come from? Or has it just always been that way? I mean, I really have a big question mark. I think your question is a very, very good one. And we'll see. But, I'm glad that I'm old and not young. Because I think the world that I have 3 children in their 20s, the world that they're going to face is a scary one that way. We seem to be sliding backwards. It's taken us thousands of years to rise out of the muck into the current amazing technologically advanced and adept society, which is a wonder on some level. It's a very fragile thing.
Here's a question for you. You like equality of opportunity and you don't like meritocracy. But doesn't the first...
Did I say that? Oh, this is a premise.
The elite.
Oh, okay.
But doesn't the first necessarily lead to the second?
Right, and of course that's the Michael Young paradox.
So isn't there a problem with that?
But you see, they think that everybody can be made equal somehow. I'm not sure quite how that works. I don't really get it. I mean, you don't like finals clubs because they're exclusive, but you love Harvard, which is even more exclusive. I can't really reconcile that somehow.
All right.
I'm one of the old liberals at Penn who has mine, so I just want you all to know that. When I first got to Penn in the late 1980s, I remember having a discussion about affirmative action. This is an answer to this gentleman's question. And I said, look, if we just hired the very best people, and if you look out there at who would be the very best people by anybody's standards objectively, they're pale yellow males for the law teaching market. I said, if we just went with the very, very best students on the numbers that would come to Penn, disproportionately, it would be whites and Asians, and there are many different kinds of Asians, including South Asians, right? I said, okay, there are at those days, 175 law schools. What would happen? We're diverse. You all are doing this, and we're the diverse law school. We don't do this. We stand for a different way of doing it. What do you think will happen? And the answer was, good students won't come to Penn anymore because they will think they will lose some kind of advantage, and I think there will be an inevitable fear in the corporations that if they don't show themselves in some way to be diverse, this gentleman said it earlier, people won't buy their products. I just really wonder about that. But I don't see, as Professor Wack said, any easy solution.
It's a collective action problem.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's no coordination mechanism to get together the people who want to rebel and say, no more, it's enough, we'll do the experiment. I mean, Nike claimed in Pravda, aka the New York Times, that Nike, lost business because it stood up to Kupernik. I forget the exact details. People have a very short memory. You can weather that storm.
Listen, at Penn, this is an answer to your question, after what happened to Professor Wax, to get it's exactly what Professor Wax said, it's a collective action problem, but collective action needs a leader. Now, for various reasons, because I'm a very good friend of Professor Wax, I couldn't be, there'd be question of bias. I spoke to a lot of my colleagues. They all said, we will be, just treated as worms, as vermin, we don't want to do that. I mean, academia doesn't load for brave people. That's why they're academics. We're all, excuse me for that. And, no one wanted to do it.
Well, they have theirs, that's the thing.
I guess.
I mean, the people who have tenure have what they want, and the juniors want it, so.
I mean, I think as the basis for collective action, like in terms of, what am I trying to quote here? Like Ron Unz and others, I guess, have said that, white Protestant identity was like really targeted for dilution so that waves of immigrants could come in and assimilate. But I think of the recent immigrants, the ones that are more cohesive culturally are the Asians. So I think that group solidarity can be a basis for collective action within this like more right.
But I don't see it happening.
Not yet. Hope you're right.
Amy, you're a force of nature, and everybody here is tremendously enjoying this. I'm curious, and I want to give you the occasion since you're on camera, and this will be on YouTube. Is there something in the last years or so that you've regretted saying, or where you thought, I probably should have said this differently, or something? This is a forum, I'm just curious about this, but this is also your occasion to make an apology.
You wouldn't believe how many times I've been asked that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And you've never come up with one.
Not really. I don't really regret, I can think of having said things maybe a little more carefully that I could certainly be open to, but I don't regret anything that I said. And I'm not saying everything I said is 100% right or accurate, but I don't regret having said it. I mean, the one thing I do regret some things. I regret the effect it's had on my family. Has been, I wouldn't want to visit that on my family, although my kids are very, very tough and very grounded.
They have to be.
Yeah.
Deal with you.
On my spouse, it's made things a little bit hard for him because he's a professor at the med school. And also I regret, actually, this is not something to regret that I can really correct, but I regret that I'm not a political person. It's a double-edged sword. If you're a loner, as I've always been, that I've, always kind of thought for myself, and I credit my dad with that, who really encouraged me to do that. You can then be a dissident. A friend of mine who came from Eastern Europe as a child said, the people who dissent, the dissident right in the United States, they remind me of all the quasi-autistic people I knew in Eastern Europe who were dissidents. You have to be a little bit autistic to be a dissident because there's so much social pressure to conform. And all of this valence, this moral valence, you're a bad person. You're not just wrong, you're bad, you're evil, you're mean, right? You're nasty. And being a woman, it's especially sharp because women are supposed to be nice, right? But it's the dissidence it's the loner element that allows you to do this and endure it, that also makes you a really bad politician. So you can't, marshal the
We
forces
have
behind you.
much greater freedom, and you're enjoying that, I think.
Tom?
How do you defund the media, or do you not think the media are at least as much of a problem as academia?
Oh, they are. But they're still on the internet, although they're doing their best to squelch it. I think there is a vigorous, fascinating, wonderful community of dissident right on the media. And, you just have to know what the blogs are, what the sites are. I mean, when Steven Pinker said, and he got himself in hot water, there's some really educated, really intelligent people in the dissident right. He's absolutely right about that. So the media, I guess it includes the
But
internet.
it's far from mainstream.
Yeah. No, the New York
CNN's
Times is
ratings are cratering, right?
the New York Times is
CNN.
just awful.
They're
CNN
doing
is
it-
just awful.
They're doing it to themselves. They're defunding themselves.
Yeah.
Can I make one quick tactical point as to how you can stop it in academia? So everybody has highfalutin moral arguments. I would just say tax policy. So the biggest assault on the rich states was the state and local tax deduction limitation last year in the tax bill, right? So one thing with the funding of academic medicine and research is the overhead and the tuition. So right now, if you're from the National Science Foundation, you get a graduate student scholarship, you get your tuition paid, but you don't see that as a student. The National Science Foundation just writes a check. So you could replace that with a fixed dollar block grant, and then the universities would have to cut the tuition in order to attract the elite students. And then right now, they have lobbied to keep their overheads, right? So I pay $1 out of my grant. Harvard takes 69 cents. It's the highest in the country, but even the poor universities are at 60 cents. Foundations won't let you pay more than 10% overhead. So
Right.
that could be in a 51 Senate omnibus bill, 2,000 pages long, that they now limit all federal overhead grant to educational institutions to 10% or some basket
Yes.
tied to foundations. And overnight, the academic administration in the sciences and engineering would evaporate because they are so dependent on it. So if you want your torpedo, lobby for that.
Well, that's the biggest scam going. Several people have told me about this. So, 69, 70% and up, it goes to overhead. Well, of course, that doesn't even stay in the sciences area. It
It
goes to,
cross-subsidizes
it cross-subsidizes
diversity, yeah, blah, blah,
the
the whole
diversity
thing. So
inclusion
get rid of that
office.
and just tie it, because Gates Foundation won't pay that, right? These big philanthropic organizations won't pay that overhead. So I think if you want to put together a band in politics to do something, it's just like how some of these other deductions showed up in the tax bill in the dead of night. That's how Republicans win, right? Be Mitch McConnell, not Nancy Pelosi.
Well, right. But I think the Republicans need to get more tuned into this stuff because, they're not very sophisticated about it. So this is absolutely a possible growth area. The government funds these institutions to a very rich extent, and that's a problem. But I think the private philanthropy, certainly at Penn, it's absolutely massive. Every time you turn around, some self-satisfied rich couple is giving, 30 million, 40 million, 50 million for this, for that, and the other. And as someone said, part of the problem is that these people are true believers, or they don't think very hard about it. Their politics is very superficial. So all of these things are potential strategies, but I think I think a lot of what's going on needs to get away from the universities. The universities are becoming, in some ways, obsolete. They're not corrupt and obsolete. Yes.
Well, with that sad conclusion. Yeah. This has been a rousing performance, Amy, and thank you very much for coming.